Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Flip Side. Now, this episode is slightly different. Rather than having two people debate, we're going to have different nuanced perspectives on this subject. So, rather than a discussion of what is the woke right and is it a problem, how worried should we be, I think that there are those who some might argue are on the woke right, but may not identify with the label, and so find it difficult to necessarily defend the woke right because they may well be classed as part of it, but don't necessarily see themselves as such. And then there's also those who some argue are trying to police right-wing thought, but they're actually liberals or people on the left that have perhaps become dissatisfied with those types of politics and have, over the last few years, because of the shifting political sand, have increasingly been associated with the right, but that they should not necessarily be in a position to be able to police what constitutes a legitimate and credible right-wing perspective. So I guess from where we're standing, as an organisation, we are people that support freedom of speech, but we also support a colourblind politics. We are keen and uh, assertive about making sure that we hear a wide range of views, and that we need to listen and pay attention to people's grievances when it comes to issues that are thorny, like migration, national identity, social cohesion. But we are steadfast in our opposition to racism, conspiracy theories, essentializing people based off of race, and presenting a view of Western society and Western history as primarily a force for evil in the world. And that's why I think it's interesting to hear different perspectives on this discussion of the woke right, because I think if you define what the woke right is, I would broadly say that if you take core tenets of woke, which is the sacralization of minority identities, but particularly the kind of sacralization of racial identity. But we also know this also happens when it comes to sexual identity and gender identity. It also tries to recast Western history and the Western contribution as fundamentally negative, racist, patriarchal, all of those things. I also think it engages in a purity test. It often takes a maximalist approach. So if you are concerned about racism, for example, you are only credible to them if you take a view that racism embeds all aspects of interactions between different groups in all structures, and it is the primary cause of racial disparities. So they're very monocausal in their approach. And if you don't subscribe to all of those tenets, then you are kept out of the fray and chastised as essentially a racist. Remember, you're either racist or anti-racist. Silence is violence. We all remember all of those phrases. And I think one of the biggest aspects of woke is hostility to freedom of speech. So very comfortable cancelling and silencing and chastising people for the most minor aggressions or transgressions as they saw them. So when it comes to the woke right, I think that how I understand it is that many of those core tenets of woke that united a whole range of different people in their criticism, this is also what we're seeing increasingly emerge on the right, arguably as a reaction. But I don't think that everything is just simply cause and effect. I think things may well have their own organizing dynamic and rationale behind them too. So some of these things, some people argue, would be double standards towards freedom of speech. So whether that is the feeling that it was fine or legitimate to cancel certain visas or deport people for expressing certain viewpoints. Again, this is also a debate because you could argue that that speech has veered into incitement to violence or glorification of terrorism, and therefore it's not of the same kind and scale as perhaps gender critical speech, but this is obviously up for discussion. But we've seen the people like the artists like UKIP and Bob Villain, in when it comes to Glastonbury, people calling for them to be charged and arrested and prosecuted. But were we not talking about freedom of speech, even for those that we completely oppose and disagree with before? So is that a double standard there when it comes to freedom of speech? And then we're seeing in some quarters, particularly on the internet, and I think the left was because they had a left-leaning social media platform before Elon Musk took over. They're very happy to weaponize the internet and censorship. Are we seeing the same thing now on the right? We've got the Trump administration forwarding claims that there's a genocide against white people in South Africa, which is a baseless claim. And just as I would oppose exaggerated, misleading, and false claims about race and racial discrimination when it came to the Black Lives Matter movement, that doesn't mean that I am okay with it when it comes to claims of white genocide. I remember the identitarian movement claimed that there was a trans genocide going on, and that American police were systematically killing unarmed black men almost for the fun of it. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues to do with discrimination against trans people. Doesn't mean there's not issues to do with policing and race. That doesn't mean there's not issues to do with white farmers, but it's the exaggeration, and I'm not seeing the same things being called out. And why is that? Is it better, or is this just the pendulum inevitably swinging, and it's just a balance and a mirror to what was happening before? And then you get questions of, I'm increasingly seeing people call for people to be deported and saying that they're not American or they're not British because of their racial or religious identity. That to me is a complete undermining of the victory of our civilization, which is, nation states built on more than tribal ethnic identity, and the ideals and principles of our civilization of liberal democratic society. Are we now saying that those can just be reduced to ethnicity? I've seen certain attacks against Vivek Ramaswamy on that basis, but also the Reform chairman, Zia Yusuf, being attacked as not being a real patriot because he is brown and Muslim. So again, is this the woke in reverse? And I think that there are other issues to grapple with as well, whether that's history. You see huge figures on the American right like Tucker Carlson, who have increasingly viewed the West as a force for bad in the world historically and presently. There's obviously some understandable reasons for that when it comes to some failed foreign policy interventions. But I think he's taken it much further, such as when we see stuff like the platforming of quack historians who say that Winston Churchill was the real villain of the 20th century. Now, that idea really calls into question so many things that to me does as much to undermine the confidence and foster a sense of cultural self-loathing in our society than it does saying that, we're just racists and we're just colonialists. I think that it also says that the equality movements of the 20th century, the mid-20th century, rights for gay people, rights for ethnic and religious minorities, rights for women, were that part of the source of that was actually the triumph of the Second World War, and the sense that we needed to move into this new era where we were valued for more than just are certain immutable characteristics, that essentially undermines that origin story. And maybe that's what the intention is, obviously, to because some people believe that the reason that we have woke and the reason we have all of these anti-Western movements is really in World War II. So there's so many different aspects of this discussion. There was even things in the introduction that I've just said that I've not even touched upon that are important to this discussion too. But what we've done is bring together different perspectives on this issue. We have Ben Habib, he's a businessman and politician in the UK who was formerly of Reform, but has started his own group and is now become a dissenting voice, let's just say, against Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. And he believes that they should be going much harder in terms of protecting what he views as the indigenous people of Britain, and issues to do with mass deportations and demographic replacement, as he would see it. We also have Professor Timothy Lynch. He's an academic, and he's a conservative academic, and his work focuses on kind of political theory, conservatism, and American and British politics. And then we also have Gawain Towler, who I have known for a long time. He's the former head of press for the Reform Party, the Brexit Party, UKIP, and he's a Nigel Farage loyalist. So it'd be very interesting to hear what he thinks in terms of some of the online discourse on the right, the splits in the right, and what does a good non-woke right actually look like. Okay, so I am delighted to be joined by Gawain Towler. He is the former head of press for Reform, Brexit Party, UKIP. He has been around the Westminster block for a long time. I've known him, I think, for more than 5 years. So thank you so much for joining me, Gawain.
A pleasure.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about is some of the emerging splits on the right, both in the US and the UK, which I find quite interesting. But let's firstly start with the UK. I don't know what you think about this term, the woke right, or the online right, or the new right. Does this first and foremost kind of describe a phenomena that you recognise, and how, if you do, how would you describe what this thing is?
Yes, obviously, one does see it, because if one spends any time online, one sees this sort of stuff going on. I think I call it sort of the terminally online right. And you've got to remember, though, I was thinking about this when you first suggested we had this call. Nothing is homogenous. Why should the right all have one point of view? It seems as absurd as any other demand that everybody is the same wherever you find them. And you'll have wildly different policy prescriptions amongst those that are defined as the right. And that's not a bad thing, surely. One has pluralism within the political families as well as without.
So, yeah, so whilst I agree with you there, I guess what I think is perhaps new about this particular movement, and I think this is what some people are arguing, and that's why I want to get your views on this, is that maybe some of the things that we are seeing might be mirroring some of the things that people critiqued on the left. So one of those arguments could be what we're seeing in terms of the rise of these increasingly splintering groups on the right, which some people might think is almost like a purity test. So we don't just have the Conservative Party, which has obviously been in government. They've failed in many people's eyes. We've got the Reform Party, which are now polling at 30% plus. But now we've got these new movements. I think just in the last few days, we've had Ben Habib launch Advance UK, Rupert Lowe, formerly of Reform as well, launch Restore Britain. You also have some other ones like I think
Fix Britain. Have you come across Fix Britain?
Yes, I have. And also Reclaim Party. We've got Heritage Party. We've even got something, the Homeland Party. What do you think about this? Because you're saying that, this is diversity of opinion, but you could argue that, is this not what the left did, which was that rather than building coalitions across broader groups to bring more people in, we're almost seeing like purity spirals?
And I think you're right in the sense that The Labour and the left, the Labour movement, and not so much the Labour Party, but the left, um, was more vociferous in the past, and it all was based on purity and different levels of purity. And there's also a lack of forgiveness. If you believe that you are right with such a moral conception of that rightness, then you believe that other people are wrong to such an extent. It becomes a very angry, vituperative world. And actually, it doesn't really suit us. It doesn't suit our national character very much. It seems to be a very imported thing. And it was always the case, I found, and over the 30 odd years I've been involved in the broader practice of politics in this country, that the right thought the left were mistaken. The left thought the right were bad people, because if you have the same information as we do and you come to a different conclusion, and we are morally good, therefore you must be morally bad. Whereas we generally thought, well, they were just wrong. And that's okay. You can be wrong. It's not a crime. And you know the famous, are we the bad people? That sort of feeling, and suddenly this realization that actually moral purity, if you get it wrong, is evil. So, and the right has started to ape the left. Many, many moons ago, and I'm talking 30 plus years, I remember one of the reasons I stopped working in the Westminster Parliament back in around about 92. I mean, golly. And that was because I started to find Conservative Party workers being proud of the fact that they didn't talk to Labour Party workers. And I was used to it from Labour Party, but not from Tories. And I didn't want to be part of that. I thought that was an ugly way. Apart from the else, how do you ever learn if you only talk to people who agree with you? It seems to be a daft way of going through life. But I first saw it back then. It's not brand new. Just like cancel culture is not brand new. Back in the 90s, there was cancel culture. I was cancelled, and all the things I tried to do were banned and blocked and barred by campus activism. So nothing is that new in this world.
Well, so on that point about, some of the things that we're seeing and whether or not they're new or not, one thing that I do think is perhaps new is, obviously, I think you mentioned the very online nature of it, but also I think perhaps a strand of ethno-nationalism, or kind of race politics. And again, you might disagree with my language.
Then you had the National Front, then you had the British, the NP. You had different groups of ethno-nationalists back in the day. Again, there's always been a very small strain in British politics of ethno-nationalism. Now, I believe because of the changes wrought by mass untrammeled immigration, that strand of British politics, a much harder form of nationalism that comes into the ethno-nationalism, is getting bigger. It is becoming a more significant part of our polity. The big row earlier in the year when Konstantin Kisin suggested that Rishi Sunak couldn't be English but could be British, big kick-off, Fraser Nelson and beyond. And today, this morning, John McTernan saying that to believe in ethnic Englishness is evil. That's a very strong term, because increasingly I think people in England do see an ethnicity about English. That's something we've never, ever done before. But I think that's in opposition to other ethnicities, both external or internal in terms of UK, Scottish and Welsh. That's fine. You can be those things, but you can't be English, because that's evil, according to somebody as senior as John McTernan. And so you have different nationalities and ethnicities arriving in the country. And so Englishness is becoming a thing in a way that it wasn't when I was growing up.
I'm going to be discussing, is there a woke right? We'll be discussing the rise of the woke right. Is it a real thing? And how does it play out differently in the UK and the US? And also, how should we understand the cultural political landscape? Let's start with you, Ben Habib. Could you let us know what you think of this phenomenon?
I have, for my own purposes, defined woke as the promotion of minority rights, minority ethnicities, minority religious beliefs minorities, sexual preferences, etc. I've defined it as the promotion of those views and those interests over and above, and if necessary, to the detriment of the majority. That is what I think woke is. It's a sort of social warrior class that wishes to correct what it sees as the imbalance between the majority white privileged um, settled people, as it were, in the United Kingdom, in our case, and in other Western countries, and in other Western countries' cases, to effectively equate the imbalance that the inherent advantages that are the inherent advantage that the indigenous people, for want of a better expression, have. And it's not a social fad. Initially I thought maybe this whole thing has come about socially, but it's in fact the manifestation of regulations and law that have been put in place over the last 30 odd years that have created woke and the woke culture. And I don't think there can therefore be a woke right, because there is no regulatory or legislative framework which um, undoes that which progressive discrimination has created through its regulatory and legislative foundations. So I reject the notion that there's a woke right. I think there's undoubtedly people on the so-called right of politics, and perhaps we can define what you mean by right. But there are people on the right-hand side of politics who would wish now to discredit those who don't overtly reject progressive discrimination. So there is definitely a push back, but I wouldn't regard it as the woke right.
So you mentioned that there are people on the woke right who are probably, in other words, perhaps too aggressive against the progressive ideals and progressive doctrine, so to speak. So what, in your opinion, should be the place of the of the right? Where should they stand? How should they approach sort of the cultural and political questions of our time today?
So I think at the heart of any civilized nation should be the notion that there should be no discrimination based on ethnicity, um, immutable characteristics. I think it was Martin Luther King who said that he's not interested in the color of your skin, he's interested in the content of your character. And I think that sums it up. And I don't think that there's any possibility of equating what people might see as the imbalances, social imbalances brought about by different backgrounds. There's no way of balancing the landscape through progressive discrimination. Discrimination never leads to a balance. The only way to have balance is to rigorously pursue balance and reject any form of discrimination. And so that diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is effectively the protection and promotion of ethnic minorities, etc., needs to be removed from our regulatory and legislative framework. We need to remove the Equalities Act, which, far from making people equal, actually inculcates discrimination. We need to unpick aspects of the Companies Act 2006, which creates social justice obligations for corporates that should be entirely amoral and just pursuing profit. We need to review and I think remove from the fabric of British law the European Convention of Human Rights, because through the Convention of Human Rights, we've somehow set aside what it means to be a British citizen. And that laid the very bedrock of then the Equalities Act, progressive discrimination, etc. So we now find ourselves in a country where being a British citizen doesn't actually afford you any greater rights or benefits than if you're a foreigner. In fact, because of progressive discrimination, those coming to this country almost get a better shake of the dice than British citizens do. We need so that, lots of people have seen the symptoms. It's very important to understand the underlying causes, and they are regulatory and legislative in nature. And what we need to do is revoke and repeal the underlying causes with the absolute focus on everyone being equal, there being no discrimination, that we return in the business sense and indeed in employment generally to the meritocratic form of discrimination as opposed to based on, immutable characteristics.
Okay, that's all good. So I've heard many conservatives talk about the importance of defending certain traditional values, but if they're trying to do so through what some would call pressure tactics, demanding ideological conformity, promoting in essence identity-based grievances, of course not in the leftist way, but all the same it is being promoted, or if they're engaging in moral superiority, these are precisely the features of what critics would call woke behavior. It's just repurposed for conservative ideals or goals. So, whether we like the term or we agree with the term woke right or not, there is strong evidence that, as you did mention to your point, that parts of the right do exhibit a woke like political style.
There's a pushback, but I think it's important not to conflate what you're defining as woke right with a recognition and an acceptance of the nation state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, its history, its Christian roots, its culture. And there has been a dramatic setting aside of all things British in the last 30 years. And it is eschewed. Indeed, people like me who actually take their lead from the past, understand our modern constitutional and cultural context by reference to where we came from. People like me are very against that. We need to understand our history. We need as a nation, if we're to survive as a nation and as a society, we need, frankly, to be proud of our country and proud of where we came from. And all of that is being trashed in the pursuit, I think, this false pursuit of progressive discrimination, this false understanding that through the Human Rights Act, it affords you no greater benefit in life to be a British citizen than being a foreigner. That all needs to be rejected. We need to go back to understanding what it means to being British, where we are and where we came from.
Tim, thank you for joining. So far, in his introduction, for example, Ben has described woke and wokeness as sort of a social warrior class seeking to rebalance what they would see as inequality between whites and everyone else in society, right? So he does reject the notion of the woke right, but he does realize that there are people on the right who may be perhaps a little bit aggressive in how they are pushing back against progressive ideals. But he does definitely stand by the need to push back against progressive discrimination, as he just mentioned. And he feels the way forward is really to have a balance and not to fight discrimination with discrimination, unless we're returning to the sort of meritocratic, natural sort of way to balance and equalize society. So I would just like to ask you if you could first just set out your thoughts and your positions generally on the issue, and then we'll go from there.
So, perhaps unhappily for your podcast hits, I agree with much of what Ben has said. So, if there was an expectation, I would offer a kind of stereotypical academic-y left-wing view. I'm not that kind of academic. I do think there's a case to be made for something called the woke right, but I think it starts to break down fairly quickly. It doesn't seek an inversion of the woke left. So you've got some really screwball characters who might want to tout the virtues of white Anglo-Saxon people in the same way that the woke left might tout the superior cultures of people of color. But I think they're very much of a minority. The woke right, in lots of ways, I think it describes a disposition that they have a sense of urgency and anger because of the dominion and hegemony of the woke left, and respond in kind. And I've always found that to be deeply unhelpful in terms of trying to undermine some of the absurdities of the woke left. But the capture of so much ideological, certainly campus, university terrain by the left, and the exclusion of conservatives from those institutions has necessarily, and the means, of course, through podcasts and social media to actually develop platforms, has made them seem more coherent than possibly is the case. So that would be my approach to the question, Ada.
In terms of populism, where does that fit into all this? Would you say that the woke right is simply the latest iteration of populism, so rooted less in economics or class struggle and more in cultural identity and perceived social marginalization?
Yes, I think I think populism has no one silver bullet explanation, but clearly you've got a failed political class which comprises centre right and centre left. It was Patrick Deneen, a philosopher in the US, is, I think, very interestingly described populism as a response to the failure of classical liberalism on the right and progressive liberalism on the left. Neither answered the concerns of an increasingly displaced and dislocated working class. I mean, it's hard to put a precise date to this, but I'd give you the ascension of China to the WTO. That advanced the interests of a kind of classical liberalism rooted in free trade and capitalism, which, in Trump's rhetoric, and it's not wholly incorrect, sold out the American worker. And then the progressive liberals came in and completed the kicking by saying, not only are you outmoded and grounded in a kind of outdated localism, but you're also racist and homophobic, and you must be sidelined and denied access to all the sorts of cultural institutions which should define the contemporary West. So populism is a response to both left and right, and I think that's missed. And we call it right populism, or we call it right woke, which is our concern here today. But I think in lots of important ways, the response we're seeing now is from a working class left position who are fed up being told by an elite laptop class, the Glastonbury set, we create that new demographic, that they are in some way culturally and morally inferior to them. Well, of course, at some point, ordinary people upon whom great economies, great nations like Britain and the United States, that the men, and they mostly were men that died on the beaches of Normandy and came home and made societies. And they look on their couch, those that are still around, and see a drug-addicted, unemployed, computer game-obsessed 25-year-old and ask what happened. And people don't stay quiet in the face of that kind of cultural dislocation. So Farage, without wishing to leverage him in too early to our discussions, and Trump, I think, are very much of a piece. It's not an identical phenomenon, but I think they're a necessary and predictable, if not inevitable, response to the alienation which has been foisted on ordinary people, the common people. I'm reminded of the Pulp song that, of course, is recurrent at Glastonbury this time of year. It was the selling out of these common people which has made their response through imperfect agents like Farage and Trump inevitable.
I will endorse all of that. I absolutely endorse absolutely all of that, Tim. Very well put. And I would just add, the salient issues are not, do we want a Thatcherite form of international trade and regulatory and tax framework, or do we want a traditional Labour attitude? The schism in politics is between the liberal elite, who are now also, in my mind, we haven't discussed selfish interest. So, I mean, the schism in politics is between the liberal elite, the liberal global order, as I call them, on one side, and those of us who want to govern the country through the nation state, through the apparatus that we set up over centuries, our parliament, our institutions, our domestic law, understanding the democratic unit that is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and making policies for the betterment of that democratic unit and its people. And that is the schism. And populism comes, I think, on my side of the debate. But it is through imperfect agents. And I think Farage is a particularly imperfect individual, which is why I've launched this political party today, which, Tim, you would be 100% welcome to join, judging by the comments you've just made. You know, we need people on the political landscape to identify the problem clearly so that they can then identify the solutions properly, and we can go back to having a settled country. We won't settle the country, we won't have a country, we won't settle the country unless we can have a proper conversation about this. And it's a great tragedy if the future of our people is left in the hands of people like Farage.
So Tim, do you have a question for Ben? It could be anything that was discussed already, or just anything you had, the top of your head.
Ben is a fascinating political character. I suppose I'm an academic, so I don't have to build policy platforms or seek power. But I wonder how far we're actually shouting into the wind that if you took immigration as an established fact, sure, you could close up the borders tomorrow. You're still dealing with a society that will be living with the consequences of unchecked immigration for generations to come. How do you resolve that? How do you undo damage that's been done? How do you integrate? How do you absorb immigrants that are already here into this national mission?
It's a really good question, Tim, and it's one which I reflect on a great deal. I don't think we actually know in the country the extent of the damage that's been done. We know that damage has been done. We don't know how far that damage is, how far it's got. And we need a holistic approach. First of all, if I can talk about it from an economic perspective, we do need to empower the British worker. We must take the knee of the state off the British worker's neck. And we've got to create incentives for people to work so that the benefit system can't be seen as a career opportunity. We've got to promote British workers into work. So it's absolutely vital that we promote British workers into British jobs, because one of the biggest drivers of the problems of immigration that we face is cheap imported labor replacing British workers. The notion that the Brits don't want to work, and we've got 7.7 million people out of a 31 million workforce actually on universal credit. We have to right that balance. That economic balance has to be righted. We've got to have a greater incentive for people to work, so there's less of a need for immigration. That's vital. And then the other thing that we've got to do is have a holistic approach to immigration itself. The first step, I think, Tim, we've got to take is a complete moratorium on indefinite leave to remain and the granting of British citizenship until we understand the extent of the damage that our unbridled immigration has created. We've just got to make sure we have the ability to send home those who've come here. And to have time in which to make those decisions rather than giving lots of people indefinite leave to remain and British citizenship. We've got to have a move towards deporting all people who are here illegally. Now, that's a very demanding task. Some people put that figure at 1.2 million odd people. That's a lot of people to deport, but it is something that has to be done. If you're in this country without permission, you have to be removed. You have to remove the economic incentive for them to be here. So they mustn't be allowed to get benefits if they're foreigners, if they're not British citizens. You've got to take away that economic pull that they have. You have to remove the free access that they get to the NHS, to our schooling system, etc., etc. And I think if you take that approach, and I mean, there are other ways to do it as well, raise the minimum wage in order to qualify for a work visa, make sure that dependents don't come to the country with you when you come on a work visa or when you come as a student, and that you have to leave the country at the end of all of that. You know, there's a whole framework of policies that need to be implemented. And only once they're implemented will we know the extent of the damage to which you referred, Tim. Only then will we know it, because then we'll be able to see what we're left with. And then I think, Tim, we need a much more muscular, if that's the right word, of approach to being British. You know, I know David Starkey well, and I have great admiration and respect for him. And I said to him, I think people at school should be singing the national anthem. He said, Ben, we're British. We don't sing the national anthem at school. We carry our national identity in our pockets. We don't wear it on our sleeves. And of course, that's a wonderful thing. And that is how it was when I was growing up. But I don't think we have the luxury of that anymore. I think we need to be singing the national anthem at school. We need to be having the Union flag up. We need to understand our cultural roots much more clearly. We need to positively integrate. We need to tell people who come here, you are coming to the United Kingdom. We are constitutionally a Christian culture. This is where we came from. This is what you're joining. You're free if you like to be a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever. But it is our culture that has to dominate. It's our law, and you will be equal under the law alongside British citizens. We can't have Sharia councils and that sort of thing. Are you with me? It's a holistic approach it's multifaceted, and it requires enormous fortitude to hold the course.
Well, I'm sympathetic to some of the aspirations there. My concern, I think, is a practical one.